My husband stood there, frozen. His eyes were wide, and his mouth slightly open, but no words came out. I could feel the weight of his gaze burning into me, silent, filled with confusion and hurt. And standing beside me was a man who could change everything. I didn't know how long he'd been there, but in that instant, I knew my entire world had just shifted. The room felt smaller, colder, and I couldn't bring myself to look away from him. How did this happen? How did we get to this moment? To understand that, I need to take you back to where it all began. 3 years ago, I married David, a man who embodied everything I had ever dreamed of. He was kind, dependable, and deeply committed to his Christian faith. David didn't just go to church, his faith was a foundation in every part of his life. He lived by it, believed in it with every fiber of his being, and I admired that about him. He had this unwavering sense of right and wrong, a moral compass that always guided him. Our life together felt secure, built on trust, love, and a shared belief in something greater. We were a team, working towards a future we both dreamed of. We spent our weekends in the warmth of our home, cooking dinner together, sharing stories, laughing until we couldn't breathe. We'd discuss our plans, maybe even children one day, and it all felt perfect. I thought we had everything figured out. But life has a way of changing things when you least expect it. I decided to sign up for a night class. A simple choice, or so I thought. It was just something to occupy my time, a way to learn something new, to meet new people. That's where I met Idris. He was our teacher. He had this quiet intensity about him, a calm confidence that came from his strong Muslim faith. He wasn't just a teacher to me, he was someone who lived his beliefs with the same passion David did, but in a completely different way. Where David was focused on his Christian values, Idris held fast to the principles of his Muslim faith. At first, it seemed harmless, a few class discussions, learning from one another. But as the weeks went on, those conversations grew deeper, more personal. We started sharing more than just academic thoughts. We'd talk about life, faith, and even our struggles. I never imagined that something so simple would lead to a place I never could have predicted. At first, Idris was just my teacher. Calm, patient, and always so composed. He had this way of speaking that drew people in, not with force but with quiet wisdom. I was never the type to get close to my instructors, but there was something different about him. His eyes seemed to take in every word, as though he were truly listening. And when he spoke, it wasn't just about the material, we'd discuss ideas, philosophies, things that went beyond the classroom. His perspective was different from what I was used to, and I found myself intrigued by his views. In the beginning, it was harmless. We'd chat after class about the day's lesson, and I'd leave the classroom, thinking little of it. But the more I saw him, the more I started to notice how much time we spent talking. Our conversations became longer, more personal. He'd ask me about my life, my experiences, even my beliefs. There was an ease between us, something I hadn't felt in years. And in those moments, I realized how much I'd been missing, a connection that I didn't know I craved. He didn't just talk to me like a student, but like someone who understood me. It was as if he saw parts of me that I hadn't even noticed in myself. He made me feel important, listened to. I had never really felt that with anyone in a long time, not even with David. At first, I brushed it off as just a friendly bond, but then the little things started to happen. A lingering look when our eyes met, his smile lasting just a beat longer than it should have. A touch on my arm when handing me a paper, and the warmth that stayed with me long after. It was subtle, but I couldn't deny the electricity that sparked in those moments. And then came the late-night messages. At first, it was casual, just a text about class, maybe a question about an upcoming test. But as the weeks went on, the messages became more frequent. And the tone, it started to shift. They weren't just about assignments anymore. They became personal, thoughtful, almost intimate. Each time my phone buzzed, I felt a strange pull to check it immediately. The words in his texts, simple as they seemed, carried a weight. A warmth that I hadn't realized I needed. Before I knew it, I found myself waiting for them. The connection was growing stronger, and with every text, I couldn't help but feel that something was shifting inside me. One evening, after class, I stayed behind to ask Idris about an upcoming assignment. The classroom was quiet, almost empty, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the space. Most students had already left, but I lingered behind to catch up on a few things. It was then that I realized how late it had gotten. Nearly everyone was gone, and I was the last one to leave. Idris was at his desk, scribbling something on a piece of paper, and I figured it was the perfect time to ask him a few questions. We started talking about the next lesson, and at first, everything seemed normal. His voice was calm, as usual, and I could tell he was focused on helping me understand the material. But then something shifted. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, something unspoken. His eyes, which had always been warm but professional, were now intense, holding my gaze in a way I hadn't noticed before. I shifted uncomfortably but didn't pull away. He began to walk toward me, his movements slow, deliberate. When he stopped beside my desk, he pointed to something on my paper, leaning just a little too close. His hand brushed mine as he showed me what he meant, and for a second, everything stopped. It was a simple touch, but it felt electric, like my body knew what was happening even before my mind could catch up. I pulled my hand back instinctively, but instead of backing away, he took a step closer. I could feel the warmth of his presence, close enough that I could almost feel his breath on my skin. The silence between us grew heavier. I was suddenly acutely aware of every little sound in the room, the way his eyes lingered on mine, the slight curve of his lips. There was a hesitation in the air, a kind of unspoken question hanging between us. And in that moment, I knew I had a choice. I could step back, remind myself of the boundaries I should have kept, or I could give in. I knew it wasn't right, that this was crossing a line I couldn't undo. But something inside me was pulling me closer to him. Without thinking, I leaned in. Our lips brushed, just for a second. That brief touch ignited something inside me, a wave of desire that I didn't know I could feel for someone other than David. For a moment, nothing else existed but the two of us in that room. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving nothing but the weight of the decision I had just made. But in that very instant, a cold chill ran down my spine. I didn't know it at the time, but David had been watching us from the shadows of the hallway, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. He had seen everything. That night, David told me he'd be working late at the office. It was a usual routine. He always worked late on Thursdays, never failing to mention it with that same reassuring tone. "I'll be home late tonight," he said, as he kissed me goodbye, his hand lingering on my shoulder like it always did. I gave him a smile, the kind I always gave, knowing he'd be back soon. But tonight, something felt off. Maybe it was the way he kissed me, like he was trying to hold on to something, or the fact that he seemed a little more distracted than usual. I told myself, it's nothing. He trusts me. Idris and we're just friends, colleagues even. There's nothing more. But those words didn't feel as convincing the more I thought about them. As the evening dragged on, the silence in the classroom seemed to grow louder. The lights flickered overhead, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though no one else was there. I pushed the thought aside and focused on the lesson plans I needed to finish. Then, the door creaked open, just slightly at first, almost like it was a draft. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was another student, or maybe one of the cleaners coming in to finish up their work. But then, I saw him. David. Standing there, just outside the doorway. His face was unreadable at first, like he hadn't fully processed what he was seeing. But then I saw it. His eyes widened, and his mouth parted just enough to let out a shaky breath. Time seemed to slow. The world outside the classroom disappeared. I could hear the soft hum of the lights above, but it felt like everything else was drowning out. My heart raced as I froze, caught in that moment, not knowing what to say or do. Idris was standing next to me, and I could feel the awkwardness hanging in the air, but all I could think about was David, my husband, the man I loved and had promised everything to, standing in the doorway, looking at us like he had just witnessed a tragedy. There was no yelling. No rage. He didn't even raise his voice. But his eyes spoke volumes. He looked at me, his expression slowly turning from disbelief to pain. The hurt in his gaze cut deeper than anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just a look of betrayal, it was a quiet devastation. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to apologize, but nothing came out. The words wouldn't form. There was no explanation that could undo the truth in that moment. David's lips parted, and in a whisper that I could barely hear, he asked, "Why?" That single word was more painful than any accusation. It wasn't angry, it wasn't even a question, really. It was a plea. A plea for an answer that I couldn't give. A plea for the truth that neither of us was ready to face. The silence that followed was unbearable. I thought he might say more, but instead, he just turned around, slowly, as though he were carrying a heavy weight. His footsteps echoed down the hall, each one like a hammer to my chest. And then the door slammed shut behind him. The sound of the door closing was deafening, it was like the final judgment, the point of no return. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment I lost him. I stood there, numb, unable to move. My eyes were fixed on the door, as though I could will it to open again, to fix everything. But it never did. I didn't know what to do, what to say. Idris stood there too, not knowing how to comfort me, or maybe he was just as stunned by what had just happened. My thoughts were racing, but all I could hear was the thudding of my own heartbeat and the cold, empty space where David had once stood. And in the silence that followed, I knew, no matter how much I wanted to fix this, no matter how much I loved David, everything had already been broken. I tried calling him over and over again, but his phone went straight to voicemail every single time. Each time I heard the click, it felt like a dagger to my chest. I kept dialing, desperate, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would pick up and let me explain. But he didn't. There was nothing. Just silence. And I didn't know how to fill that silence. I sat there in the dark, the house too quiet, too still. It was the kind of quiet that presses on your chest, suffocating you. The reality of what I had done settled over me like a heavy, unbearable weight. How had I let it get this far? How had I betrayed the man who had been nothing but good to me? The man who trusted me with everything, who had loved me, believed in me, and never once questioned my loyalty. And yet, there I was, alone and full of regret. I tried to remember the last time I had been happy, the last time we'd laughed together. It felt so distant now, like a dream slipping through my fingers. I thought about the vows we had taken, the promises I had made to him. They were supposed to be sacred. But now they felt like empty words, words that I had broken without a second thought. The guilt crushed me, each thought making the pain worse. I had crossed a line with Idris, something I could never take back. And for what? A fleeting moment of desire? A moment that had cost me everything? I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror without feeling sick. I found myself at the church the next day, sitting in the back row, hoping that God could give me some answer I didn't have. I didn't know what to pray for. What could I even ask for? Forgiveness? Was I even worthy of it? I had broken the trust of the one person who mattered most, and I knew I could never undo the damage. The stained glass windows seemed to mock me, the sunlight filtering through them, casting colorful patterns on the floor. They were beautiful, but they couldn't mask the emptiness inside me. I sat there for hours, lost in my thoughts, praying for something to make it better, for some miracle to fix what I had done. But all I could feel was the weight of my own failure. I thought about David, how his face had looked when he saw us, how his eyes had held so much hurt. I wondered if he would ever forgive me. If he could ever look at me the same way again. But no matter how many times I begged for forgiveness, no matter how much I prayed, I knew deep down that things could never go back to the way they were. I had shattered everything we had built together. I had broken him, and I had no one to blame but myself. Later, I found myself staring at our wedding photo, the one we had taken on our wedding day, smiling, so full of hope. Now, that photo seemed like a lie. The woman in that picture didn't exist anymore. She was gone. And all I was left with was the mess I had made. A mess I couldn't clean up, no matter how hard I tried. I didn't know what came next. All I knew was that I had destroyed everything, and now, I had to live with the consequences. I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe David will never forgive me. Maybe he'll walk away and never look back, and I'll spend the rest of my life living with the consequences of that one moment of weakness. I can't say I blame him. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fix this or if he'll ever trust me again. But what I do know is this: everything I had with him, everything we built together, it's all broken now. And that is something I will have to live with for the rest of my life. If you're watching this, I want you to understand something. If you've ever felt the temptation to cross that line, to let yourself drift into something you know isn't right, remember this: one moment of weakness can destroy everything you love. One moment, one bad choice, can unravel years of trust, love, and loyalty. I never thought I would find myself in this position, but here I am, alone, lost, and broken because of the choices I made. I didn't just hurt David, I hurt myself too. I let a fleeting moment cloud my judgment, and now I'm paying the price. If you're ever tempted, think twice. Think about the people you love, the ones who trust you the most. Think about the damage you can do that may never be undone. I don't know if David will ever come back, if he'll ever look at me the same way again, but I can't change what's already happened. All I can do is hope that someone out there learns from my mistake and doesn't have to go through the heartache that I'm living with now. And maybe, just maybe, if there's any hope left for me, it's in the lessons I've learned through all of this, the hard way. The one thing I know for sure is this: everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and trust, it's been shattered. And I have no one to blame but myself. So, now I turn it to you: what would you have done if you were in David's shoes? How would you have reacted if you found out your partner betrayed your trust in such a way? Or maybe, what would you have done if you were in my situation, caught in a moment of weakness, knowing the consequences of your actions? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Share them in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, if it made you reflect on love, loyalty, and the choices we make, please give this video a like. And if you want to hear more gripping stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let's keep the conversation going and dive deeper into the stories that matter most.